pages. And hello, everybody. My name is Emily, and I am the community manager here at 2 Diabetes, working with Diabetes Hands Foundation. And we are here for a live interview with the founder of one of the Big Blue Test Grantee organizations. And for those of you who know, we just finished the 2015 Big Blue Test campaign. We reached our goal of 10,000 logged Big Blue tests, which means that the grants get to go through and fund some fantastic projects. And a couple of those projects are going to be headed up by Carb DM, which was founded by today's guest, Tamar Sofer. Oh my goodness, Tamar, I forgot to confirm how to pronounce your last name. Sofer Gary?
Yes.
Yay. Hi, Tamar. Thanks for being here.
Hi. Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Let's start off with, who are you and what's your connection to diabetes?
So my name, as you said correctly, is Tamar Sofer Gary, and I'm a T1D MOM. My daughter Tia, who is now 15 and a half, was diagnosed almost 7 years ago. Next month will be 7 years since she was diagnosed. She was 8 at the time. And like many people in the type 1 community, for us it came totally out of the blue. We have no prior connection to type 1 diabetes. No one in our family has type 1 diabetes. We didn't know very much about it. And one day it was just, your daughter has type 1 diabetes, take her to the hospital. And that was our first introduction to type 1 diabetes.
Wow.
And, yeah.
What were the symptoms that Tia was exhibiting at that time?
So this is just between you and I, but she had started wetting her bed. She was 8, so it's okay. But she had started wetting her bed back in August. And it started from maybe once every week or two, and then increased to once a week, to once a night, and built up to 3 times a night. My washing machine actually died from doing all the laundry. And I called her pediatrician and said, she hadn't been wetting her bed, and now she is. And they kept saying, oh, well, it's still within the norm. 8 years old, there's still X% of the population that wets their bed. And I think after a couple times of that, I just stopped calling. So I realized, maybe when it got to 3 times a night, I should have kept calling and asking. But we only really saw the symptoms at night. During the day, I think, this is just my hypothesis, I don't know, but I think because she was sensitive to insulin and active, her pancreas was still able to manage her blood sugars enough during the day that she wasn't running to the bathroom or drinking high quantities of water during the day. It only really presented at night. So she wasn't diagnosed until January, and even then she wasn't in ketoacidosis or anything like that. Her blood sugar was only 419, and she wasn't in ketoacidosis.
That's incredible. So in a way, it might have been a somewhat slow onset for childhood onset type 1, yeah?
Yeah, very slow. Again, it was, almost 5 months, and she lost a pound of weight. I mean, it was very, very gradual, very gradual.
That's really interesting because we think of childhood onset of type 1 as something that kind of hits you like a bolt of lightning, and all of a sudden you've got all of these symptoms and you're just dropping weight like crazy and all of this stuff. That's interesting that in this presentation as well, not just comparing childhood onset type 1 and slower onset in adults that we tend to call LADA, but sometimes for kids it can also come on slowly and be, in a way, kind of sneaky.
Yeah, it was slow. And the interesting part of this, and I keep wondering, because we were looking for a solution for bedwetting. I mean, we really, even when I took her to the doctor in January, it was for a solution for bedwetting because she wasn't sick. I mean, she wasn't, throwing up. She didn't have stomach ache. She didn't have a headache. She wasn't especially tired. I mean, we were looking for a solution for bedwetting. And I had looked for something at the end of October. There's some hormone nasal spray that works like a Band-Aid for bedwetting. You spray it at night and you can go on a sleepover and supposedly not wet your bed. And they did a urinalysis before you give that. You do a urinalysis, and that was done at 2 in the afternoon, and it came back normal. I'm like, how can it be that at the end of October, by which time I know she was wetting at least once a night, her urinalysis in the middle of the day came back normal? So it was a very, very slow progression towards, and even the doctor, when she sent her for tests in January, was not suspecting diabetes. So it was a very, very slow onset. So yes, it can be.
That's
Yeah.
a diagnosis story that I don't think I've heard before. So then you guys got the big surprise news eventually, and then how did you go from that news to founding Carb DM? What was that transition? What happened for you, and in your thoughts and in your inspirations that brought you to found Carb DM?
So that was also a very slow progression. It wasn't like, oh, now I've got to start a nonprofit. Actually, starting a nonprofit was never in my plans, even when we started the individual programs that eventually led to Carb DM being established. It was more about, for me, it started with helping other families who were diagnosed. That I realized really very quickly, that if you're 2 weeks into type 1 diabetes, you already have learned stuff that you can impart, knowledge that you can impart to other families and help them out, because the learning curve is so steep that you know stuff in 2 weeks that you can already impart to other families and help them and shorten their learning curve. So I started helping other families out really very quickly. Families we met, the day after Tia was diagnosed, we kept in touch with them and helped them out, and families we met at the introduction to diabetes class, so we just stayed in touch with families, and I would help them and mentor them. And then some other newly diagnosed families we met along the way. And then it was about a year and a half after Tia was diagnosed, I had this idea of a get together called, and I thought of calling it Coffee and Carbs, just because I thought that was a cute name. And I had read about some coffee gatherings that type 1 parents had done in Boston. And I sent out an email on a local email list for parents of children with type 1 diabetes that's here in the Bay Area called Brave Buddies. And 14 parents showed up, which kind of surprised me, because that showed that there was some interest and need for such a thing. But really, it was just about getting people together face to face to talk about it, because, excuse me, even though we all use online resources, for me, there's no substitute for the face-to-face connection. So after doing that for a few months, my daughter said to me, hey, what about something for the kids? Isn't this about the kids? So we started a program called Carbs in the Park. And it kind of, one thing led to the other. And as I always like to joke, because we're in California, it grew organically. And, someone said, I've never met another adult with type 1 diabetes. So we started a program for adults, which we fondly called Beer and Basils. And then we started a program for teens. And it all just kind of grew out of the needs of the community, who somehow came to me and said, we need this. And then I created it. And then I realized that in order to keep this going and make it sustainable, we have to have a nonprofit. And that's how Carb DM started. But it wasn't as though I said, oh, we need a nonprofit, let's start a nonprofit, and then established all these programs to go under the umbrella of the nonprofit. It was the other way around.
So when you first started all of those different programs, and I love all of the names that you chose for each one, what kinds of things did you do there? Was it really just like meet other people and hang out, or was there educational material? What did you do?
Our first programs were just, and still are, we have Coffee and Carbs, the parent gathering. We have Carbs in the Park, which is the family gathering, and Beer and Basil. And literally, they're just gatherings, casual gatherings at a bar or a cafe or in the park, or we go bowling. And I think so much education happens from that peer-to-peer support. We don't call them support groups, because we often find that if you call something a support group, people go running in the other direction. So we just call them gatherings, and they're very casual, and there's no agenda to them. When people wanted more formal education, we reached out to either parents who had the expertise or to medical professionals and started a speaker series that we call Type 1 Topics. And then we got into the more formal education, and we bring medical professionals, mental health professionals, nutritionists, a whole variety of speakers on topics that are relevant to people living with Type 1 diabetes. And we do about between 8 and 10 speakers a year on those topics. And again, the topics are often what people bring to me as a need they want, to learn about. And then we just find the speakers. And from that, we've grown to other programs, bigger programs that we'll probably talk about later on, but some programs that are for more specific populations, whether it's our mother-daughter program or our Asian outreach program or programs for the Latino community, and our biggest program being the Bay Area Diabetes Summit, which is a collaboration with nonprofits all across the Bay Area and medical institutions, which draws 400 adults and 120 kids to the kids camp.
Wow, so everything that you do is in person, is that correct, as opposed to online?
Yes, everything is in person.
Very cool. And where are you located?
We're located in the San Francisco Bay Area. Yeah, on the peninsula. Yes.
Cool. So let's start talking a little bit more about the programs that the Big Blue Test Grant is going to fund. What are they? Yeah,
so the two programs the Big Blue Test Grant is going to this year, and we're very grateful for the grant this year, are programs for our underserved communities. We have one program that's called the Asian Outreach Day, and that's, again, it's something that people came to me and said, look around, there are no people from Asian cultures at this program. And it was just a day-long kind of family day summit, and indeed, there weren't many Indians or Chinese or Koreans or Japanese families in the room, even though those cultures all have people with Type 1 diabetes. And the father who was pointing this out to me, is Indian himself, and he said, those people will not come to these programs. They keep their diabetes very secret. There is shame associated with having a chronic illness. They won't come to these kinds of programs. And he urged us to start a program specifically for the Asian community. So that's how that program started. And now we have an annual program for the Asian community, and it's Asian in the broad sense of the word, but where we address the cultural barriers to managing Type 1 diabetes. And we have a panel of people or individual speakers from various Asian cultures who talk about, what those cultural barriers are. We have mental health professionals who talk about those cultural barriers. We have nutritionists who talk about Asian foods and understanding carb counting and hidden carbs in Asian foods. We talk about participating in research and why it's important that Asians be represented in research in Type 1 diabetes, and topics like that. So that, and I mean, there are issues, we'll have a school nurse come and talk about how to work with school nurses for children with Type 1 diabetes, because often parents are so afraid that their kids will be discriminated against because they have Type 1 diabetes that they won't tell the school nurse, and that creates, a harder situation for the kid. Rather than them being discriminated against, they don't get the accommodations they need, and then they're worse off at school than had they actually told the nurse that they have Type 1 diabetes. So we just try to empower them to be open about their diabetes and deal with it openly rather than hiding it. So that is one program. And the other program we have is called...
Wait, sorry.
What?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have questions. I have some questions before we move on to the other program. First off, my first question is, how did you access the broad array of Asian communities, knowing that those communities were not showing up for your events before this, as that gentleman pointed out to you? How did you then find access to those communities and get the word out about this particular program?
That's a great question. So we have had the support of doctors and CDEs at many of the local hospitals that treat primarily pediatric patients with type 1 diabetes. And our biggest champion for this program, champions, are Dr. Tandy A. from Stanford and Dr. Avni Shah. And they're both Asian themselves, so that really helps. And they tell their patients about this program and really missing the word, but they really encourage them to come. And Dr. A has been the champion of this program, so she also reaches out to doctors at all the other ones. Dr. Tariq Ahmad from Oakland Children's Hospital, who's also Indonesian, I believe, himself. And so reaching out to specific doctors, all doctors, but especially doctors from Asian cultures. And all our speakers are Asian. All the mental health professionals who speak there are Asian. All the school nurses who speak are Asian. All the speakers are Asian. So by doing that and creating kind of a safe place for them, makes it easier to get people to come to the program.
Yeah.
So
that's fantastic. That is so needed. So let's talk a little bit then about the other program that you have going on that will be funded by this year's Big Blue Test Grant.
So the other program is called Grupo Carbs, and Carbs is an acronym for 5 great words in Spanish, which I cannot unfortunately pronounce. And we have been trying to reach out to the Latino community with type 1 diabetes ever since we were founded, realizing that that is a huge need in our area and throughout California, because there is such a large Latino community in our state. And even though type 1 isn't that prevalent in the Latino community, just because we have such a large Latino community, even with it being a small percentage, there's a lot of people with type 1 diabetes around us that are Spanish speaking, and often they're monolingual, so they don't speak any English. And we've been doing programs for the Latino community, as I said, really since we started, and it's always a challenge to get them to programs, and we've tried different approaches. And very recently, back in May, we hired a young adult with type 1 diabetes who is Latina herself. And that's really improved our ability, obviously, to outreach to the Latino community, because she can actually call them and text them and speak to them in Spanish. So that's changed things dramatically. And we've also come up with a different approach on how to have programs for the Latino community, rather than having a big program in one place that might be hard for them to reach. We're having more local programs closer to them in their community and in people's houses, which seems to be a more comfortable place for them to gather. So it'll be 3 or 4 families in someone's house, with her there as a host, and then we'll bring a medical professional who speaks Spanish to answer questions. So they get the peer-to-peer support as well as the medical professional there to answer questions. So having the funds for that to fund her, as well as these gatherings and moving them around and having them more frequently, seems to be a better approach for reaching that community. And then hopefully, if we have enough of those gatherings and they start to build community, then we can bring it towards having a bigger program, with more education, more formal education. But we really realize we need to start small and build those connections locally first. So that's our approach with the Latino community. And so far it seems to be working.
Do you know at this point how many Hispanic participants you've had?
So it varies, but at our first 2 events, we've had 5 families at each, which seems small, but it's huge compared to some other events where we've had 1.
Right.
So.
Right. No, I think that's fantastic reach.
Yeah. Irandi has actually been able to talk with probably over 40 families.
Wow.
So, and every time we get a newly diagnosed family, again, medical professionals from the different hospitals will send us patient's contact information with their permission, and when we get that information, she's able to reach out to them immediately, which makes such a huge difference to them. So whenever we get that, she calls them. So through that, she's been able to reach out to lots of new families, which we haven't been able to do effectively in the past.
Mm-hmm. Have you noticed in these 2 programs, between the program that's targeting Asians and the program targeting Hispanics, have you noticed really different questions, different topics of interests, sort of according to culture, different barriers to getting help or accessing information?
Well, so with the Latino community, a lot of the barriers are around insurance, because they don't always have insurance, and it's whatever CCS covers, and so those are a lot of the questions. And then there's a lot of questions about pumps in general and how to use them, and you know, there's a lot of barriers within the culture to having a device on you that we have heard. In the Asian community, it's more about issues within the extended family about talking about diabetes. How do you deal with the extended family and their questions about diabetes and the stigma around it? So a lot of stigma around having a chronic illness.
Uh-huh. Have you been able to find professionals who are able to really talk about the stigma specific to Asian cultures?
We have, and really the most effective speakers are people in the community who have dealt
Mm-hmm.
with it and how they and share their experiences of how they've dealt with it.
Uh-huh.
Whether it's an adult with type 1 diabetes who is diagnosed as an adult, and his father is a heart surgeon in India and still would tell him to go to the bathroom and inject in the bathroom and not around the table. And he had to educate and advocate for himself and say, no, I'm doing this at the table. Or, a mother of a child with type 1 diabetes who's from Korean descent, and her parents kept asking, when is this going to go away, or when is this going to stop, and when is he going to get better, and just how she had to educate and advocate for her son. So really the best experts on this are people who have had to deal with this themselves and how they dealt with their families and educated them and had those conversations. But the mental health professional is very good for teaching families more in the closer family unit, how to deal between the parent and child conversations and having those discussions about the parent-child relationship around diabetes.
It's really interesting. It's interesting how much culture affects our perception of chronic health conditions, or even not chronic health conditions, but just how health is conceived of in different cultures, and how important, as you say, it is to have somebody there to speak about it who's actually a member of the culture of the people that they're talking to.
Yeah.
I think it's awesome that you're doing such a fantastic job of targeting these groups, because I think a lot of times, I don't know why this is, but I feel like it's really common for diabetes-related programs to that don't target specific ethnic groups to end up being pretty Caucasian. And I don't know why that is, especially around type 1. It's something that that we talk about at Diabetes Hands Foundation, because we want to make sure, of course, that our community is welcoming to everyone from anywhere. And sometimes, for some reason, it's challenging. In the DOC, I know the Diabetes Online Community, for those of you who have not heard that acronym before, there has long been talk that the DOC has a lot of Caucasian representation and does not have a lot of representation from other races and ethnic groups. And so the work that you're doing, Tamar, is so incredibly important. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about potentially being able to expand the model that you're creating beyond the San Francisco Bay Area, or serve as a model maybe for other organizations in other places.
Yeah, that's a question we get asked often, and one of the things we're always happy to share, what we do and how we do it, and we're not exactly sure what makes it work here. I mean, we've even had it works better on the peninsula and not in the East Bay and not in San Francisco. And we don't even quite understand why it works better on the peninsula and not in the East Bay. So we would love to have someone come and kind of reverse engineer Carb DM and figure out what makes it work, you know, because we've talked about, you know, doing a Carb DM in the box and saying, here, take this and, you know, start it in your own region. And people do call and say, oh, we'd like to start a Carbs in the Park here or a Coffee and Carbs here. And it's like, you can start one program. I mean, that's really easy. Set up a time and place that works for you and do it, you know, but you kind of have to have a critical mass of people, and you have to have a really dedicated volunteer who will keep coming month after month. And, you know, and what is that critical mass of people? Because we know there's people in the East Bay, but they don't show up, or people in San Francisco. So we don't exactly know why it works here and not in the East Bay or San Francisco, or what would make it, what you need to make it work in other places. So before we even think of expanding anywhere else, we would need to understand really what are the conditions you need to make it work and why it doesn't work in other places, which are, you know, right across the bay from us. So, and right now we don't have the funds or, you know, capacity to expand beyond really our area anyway, but I would love to know what it is. I would love for this model to be available to other communities. I mean, it's not rocket science. I mean, I'm just a type 1 mom. I didn't, you know, I don't have any special skill set. So I would love for other people to have these access to these types of resources. You know, we have 4 medical centers here. That's gotta help. But what exactly makes us work that I could say to someone, here, you can start this? I'm not sure what that secret sauce is.
I think we all keep trying to figure out the secret sauce.
Yeah.
So how you mentioned that you don't really have the resources right now to do the kind of research that's necessary at the moment to find the secret sauce, which brings me to the question, how many people work at Carb DM and how many volunteers do you have?
So we have 5 part-time people, all doing different tasks and different jobs, and they all work various, you know, part-time hours. We have a board of 8 wonderful volunteers, and we have another probably 20 volunteers who help with hosting different programs and, you know, helping out at programs, you know, on an ad hoc basis. So it kind of ebbs and flows depending on what we need. But that's our kind of core group of staff and volunteers. Yeah, I'm the only full-time staff, volunteer, employee.
Wow. So you really have your fingers in every Carb DM pie, so to speak.
Yes, I kind of do.
So we had a question a little bit ago in the chat room about the Asian Day program that you talked about, and when is the next one, and is it going to be something that happens over and over again? Is there any kind of calendar for that for folks who are local to the 2 of us, because I live in the Bay Area as well, that folks could take a look at?
Yeah, so the next one is January 24th. And it's from 9 to 3, and it'll be in Fremont, and you can check our website for the exact address. And right now that happens once a year, the Asian Outreach Day. Yes, we'd love to have people come to that.
Any thoughts about expanding it?
Not at the moment. Our hope is that once people come to that program, they'll be more comfortable coming to some of our other programs. We have the Bay Area Diabetes Summit, which is in March, and we have a lot of other educational programs, and our hope is that once they become engaged, they'll be more comfortable to come to other programs.
So that you can kind of bring the folks, at least the folks from all the variety of different programs who speak English, kind of funnel into your main system of programs?
Yeah, because the Asian Outreach Day is in English, and we hope that, again, we kind of take the initial angst out of just coming into the type 1 community through that program.
Great. Fantastic. Well, Tamar, we have run out of questions in the chat room. Thank you so much for spending some time today to talk to us about the programs. And I really want to keep an eye on them because I really think that you've hit on something that has great potential really to be a model for other programs that really want to access specific communities that are not getting the services that they need, or that either aren't able to find the services, or the services are not being offered in their language, or not being targeted appropriately for their culture. I think what you're doing is some pioneering work, and so we over here at 2 Diabetes and the Diabetes Hands Foundation will be excited to see how these 2 programs that we've talked about today proceed and hopefully grow.
Well, thank you very much. We'd love to have you at the programs and check them out for yourself. Thanks for this opportunity, and thank you for the grant.
Absolutely. Oh, you're very welcome for the grant. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.